presentations. I think this one might have a few bits where we ramble a little bit because it's some ideas that we're working with. So we're sort of thinking out loud with this one. Um, but we'll get through the presentation. We'll have a few opportunities for some movement and thinking about things. There might be some things that are familiar to people who've been in our courses before, but it's really just an attempt for us to make sense of some of the ideas we've been playing around with as we develop our new course, Movements for Life, also formerly Capabilities for Life. Hi, Marianne.
Um, yeah, we'll try and keep it as unrambly as possible. Um, yeah, there'll be a little opportunity for movement at the end if you've got any objects in your house, such as a cushion, a handbag, anything. It doesn't really matter, it doesn't need to be heavy. We're going to be doing something towards the end. That's fine, Gabby. You can have your video off, no problem.
Yep.
And
Oh,
there'll be
yeah,
time at
nobody.
the end for Q&A.
Yeah, nobody needs to have their video on. Don't worry about it. If you're happy to have your video on, you're welcome to. If you just find it more relaxing, keep your video off. That's fine as well. Regarding finding objects, they don't even need to be heavy. You can think of whatever properties you want. So, depending on what time of the world you're in, if you have a glass of wine, you could use the glass of wine. If you have, I don't know, a sleeping dog or something, you could use them. It's really whatever's available to you, but weight doesn't really have any bearing on the activity. All right, so
Okay.
let me go ahead and share. Actually, let me hang on. I need to go to presentation mode first. Let me present, and then I will share. Um, present full screen. Great. Come back over here. Okay, there we are. Can I see some thumbs up? Everyone sees slides? Great. Thanks, Liz. All right. There's one more thing. There we go. All right. So today's presentation, I guess, in some ways has two names. It's gym strength versus life-based strength, or maybe versus isn't correct there. Maybe I should just say gym strength and life-based strength, which I've got in scare quotes. And then when I was preparing for this, um, and as we were developing the course that we're working on, one of the original titles for this was Building Capabilities, thinking about task constraints and capacities. So those are sort of the two ideas that were in the background as we were coming up with this. So overview today, um, we're just going to talk a little bit about this idea of gym strength and real world strength, life-based strength, whatever you want to call it. We'll talk a little bit about this prescriptive emergent continuum when we think about these things. We'll talk just a couple concepts about quantification and different ways of trying to organize knowledge and what gets lost when we try to do that. Thinking about this idea of challenges and then a Q&A. As I'm talking, if you have a good idea for a question, just go ahead and drop it into chat, and then at the end we'll get going on it. And if I find that in the middle of the presentation, if I've spent too much time just talking, we might take a break and do some questions in the middle and then keep on moving. As I said, and Jill wanted to emphasize this as well, this is sort of a chunk of highlights of themes we've been thinking about and how they sit together. And it's a lot of these ideas that are going into the course that we're working on. Um, so first thing we want to talk about, because we are sort of drawing this contrast between what I'm going to call gym-based strength or gym logic and this real world sort of emergent task-based capabilities that we're talking about today is they're two sides of the same coin, and I don't want to vilify one. So just for context, even though today we're going to be talking about this idea of life-based strength, we have done lots of presentations on the importance of sort of traditional gym progressive overload training as well, which I think is a valid tool. So if you're curious about that, you can check some of our other webinars on progressive strength training, osteoporosis, impact, and a lot of the stuff that's gone into our Strong for Life course, which is really more of a traditional strength training course. Um, but really, what we found at the end of that course is even though I think people found it valuable to learn a lot of the traditional habits and probably best practices in strength training. I think a lot of people really had this question, well, what next? How can I bring it out into the real world? How can I sort of incorporate this into my life? And this is our attempt here. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other, just that they're different tools for different jobs or perhaps different ways of trying to make sense of an issue. So anyone who's done any of our webinars before, you've seen that we always talk about this idea of the prescriptive emergent continuum. And without belaboring it too much, this is one of the big questions that we always try to find some balance on. So if you have any kind of gym experience or sports, strength and conditioning, stuff like that, you're going to be familiar with a lot of these more prescriptive concepts. So this idea of developing a specific skill, this idea of sometimes rules-based training. So for example, if you're weightlifting, what makes a good rep or a bad rep? This often what's a top-down teleological process of the coach having this idea of what the best version of the movement is, and then trying to recreate it. Always working towards optimal, maybe focusing on competition, a big emphasis on quantification. So all these things that show up in the gym, sets and reps and volume and tracking numbers and increasing your squat by 1% every few weeks, things like that. Whereas on the emergent side of things, we focus more on things like exploration, actually completing a task or fulfilling a task or a problem. Generally, this is more facilitated. It's about developing some sort of challenge or representative design that is going to have high transference to the real world. We're going to focus much more on this idea of qualitative measurement, or really thinking about like what are the qualities of these movements. Much more emphasis on play and games and problem solving, and this idea of self-organization, which is that if you just give people an opportunity to solve a movement problem, they'll come up with a pretty good solution based upon what their current capabilities are. So again, one's not better than the other. We do often talk about prescriptive side of things. If you ever come to our in-person course, we spend a lot of time talking about traditional movements and kettlebells and things like that. But it's important to remember that, yeah, these are two sides of the same coin. So talked a little about prescriptive and emergent. If you see any slides you like, we'll go ahead and we're gonna share this video. So don't worry, you'll have all the slides. So I want to begin. I don't know if anyone knows Kurt Vonnegut's anecdote about the envelope. He was one of my favorite authors. He passed away. I was going to say recently, but quite a while ago now. And he has this great story about going out to buy an envelope. And so the way the story goes, and there's different versions of it. He has it in a book. He's done it in interviews. He said, I like to just buy one envelope at a time. So I'll tell my wife I'm going out to get an envelope, and she'll say, "Well, you're not poor. Why don't you just buy 1,000 envelopes all at once, and then you don't have to go to the store and get them or deliver them at the post office." And then he has this whole story of like, well, it's not about just the process of having the envelope on hand. It's about what happens if I walk out my front door and maybe I see somebody walking a dog and I get to pet the dog. And then I'm walking down the street and I see a fire engine go by and I get to wonder what it is. And then I get into town and I see somebody I haven't known in a while. Or maybe the person I'm buying the envelope from is an interesting person, or maybe they're from a different culture. And in this act of me going out and buying the envelope, while I do accomplish the task of having an envelope so I can send a letter, at the same time, I get to see all this richness in life. And I think that anecdote is really powerful because it really gets us to think about this idea of why. Why are we doing something? It's not just about going and having the envelope in your hand. It's about everything else that falls under the umbrella of going out into the world and getting that envelope. And this kind of ties together to some of these famous images. I don't know if everyone's read any Jane Jacobs, but she has a lot of images like this. And these are these livable street images by Don Appleyard. And what he did is he sort of did this ethnographic study of going out into different neighborhoods and seeing how many different friends people had, how many different acquaintances people had, where did people hang out, where did they congregate, things like that. And what he found was that in light traffic areas where you don't have a big highway or motorway between you, people know more people. They have more friends. They have more connections. They have more places to congregate. People will use the street as a livable space. And then as streets get busier, or traffic gets faster, or if the urban planners decide to put in a highway or something like we used to have in Reading, then it completely changes things. And this is just another way of thinking about how there's a lot of richness that sometimes doesn't always get captured when we try to quantify things. And that's sort of going to be the heart of what we're talking about today, what gets lost, and how we can try to add that back in when we think about physical activity and movement and health and all these things that we like to talk about. Um, so I've got a couple concepts I want to talk about. Again, apologies to anyone who's been on the course. Gabby, I know you've heard me talk about this. Apologies in advance to Stephen because you're going to hear me talk about this a lot. But I just want to talk about a few different ideas that I think are important. They come from anthropology and public health and different things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept of the emic etic distinction. I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of tacit knowledge. And then I'm going to talk about James C. Scott's interpretation of metis and technos. So all these things sort of fall into the same category of it's very, very easy to lose the forest through the trees. So we have this little doodle here of the person on the right just kind of taking in the forest and enjoying the holistic gestalt of the forest. And then on the other hand, we have a group of people with rulers and calculators and magnifying glasses and clipboards and stuff, and they are trying to find the forest. The problem is that they are stuck at all these individual trees. So it's often impossible to quantify rich benefits behind activities. Um, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. So often when we try to isolate movement down to just specific muscles or joints or, force production, whatever, we often lose the holistic benefits. Or perhaps a better way of saying that is sometimes we forget the why, and we pretend that, everything in human life can be quantified down to the biomechanics or the kinematics of a movement. Um, so there's a quote I've been using a lot. If you've been listening to the podcast, you've heard me say it before. I recently read a book called The Metric Society by Stefan Mao. Um, and he says quantification of social phenomena is a process of disembedding, which deliberately strips away local knowledge and context of the production. And basically, what his argument is whenever you try to quantify something, you always have to ignore all this rich variability that's in it, so you can take these data sets and make them comparable to other data sets. So it's really when we quantify things, it's really the act of stripping away the context that allows us to quantify. It's an interesting book. And he himself is not against quantification. He just wants to make sure that when we quantify things, we're just doing it in the right context. Um, so this idea of tacit knowledge, it comes from Michael Polanyi, and I've got a bunch of quotes from his books, but basically it boils down to we know a lot more than we can tell. We know a lot more than we can verbalize. If I see someone on the street and I recognize their face, I know it's that person, but if you ask me to try to sit down and list every single reason why I know it's that person's face, it's very hard to describe a person's face. There's a sort of richness in perception and experience that goes beyond, being able to enumerate different things. Same thing with riding a bike. If I was going to describe the process of riding a bike, it'd be very, very hard. I'd have to have access to all these different formula and things to talk about equilibrium and things like that, or else you can just sort of ride the bike and experience what it's like to ride the bike itself. Um, and then the other one I want to talk about is this idea of emic etic distinction. So this is a concept that shows up a lot in anthropology. It's also useful when we talk about development or we try to talk about these big complex interventions we see sometimes. So this emigetic distinction is just trying to separate what is sometimes considered the external objective meanings and the internal subjective meanings. So essentially, like the why of something versus the perceived why of something, and that can be internal and internal groups. So a good example, and a lot of people have probably heard variations of this anecdote before. But for a long time now, various development agencies have been putting in wells into rural parts of the global south. And these wells overall are a net benefit. They can really help with all sorts of things like time saving, access to clean water. It's something that I think is probably objectively very good. And what we see sometimes in some communities is these wells are put in, and one of the stated reasons for putting in the wells is that there's this arduous job that usually falls on women. Women are often in charge of the water gathering, the washing, and things like that. So you'll see um, the groups of women who every single morning they might get up early, they gather together in a big group, and then they might walk several miles with heavy pots and pans and jugs and things like that to go get fresh water and come back. So the reasoning was, well, if we had access to fresh water in the well in the center of the village, then that would be a benefit for women. But what we see in certain cases is sometimes the women will still prefer to go out and go gather the water on these big long trips because sometimes the meaning of getting the water is more than just the water itself. It is um, everything that comes along with it. So gathering around with some of your friends, having some time to get away from your husbands or your children, having time to gossip and socialize and catch up. There's all this value in the act of getting the water, which is more than just ending up with water or clean dishes. Now, I don't want to minimize that because having access to fresh water and clean dishes is very, very important. But what I'm saying is there are complex nuances behind why people do things, and it's one of the things that we want to consider. Um, and then, in the similar idea, this idea from James C. Scott, which is really related, is just this idea between techne and metis, and it's just the difference between knowledge that you get from a textbook or knowledge that can be put into a textbook and repackaged, and the sort of knowledge that we only get from doing the thing itself. So this idea of metis is the kind of knowledge that can only be acquired through practice. It's this sort of embodied practice and experience. Again, this idea of riding a bike. I could write you a 10-step plan on how to ride a bike. I say, oh, here's how you ride a bike. I've just written it down. There's a huge difference between me writing down a list of what you need to think about when riding a bike versus getting the experience of riding the bike itself and all the benefits that come from doing it. Um, and all this sort of ties into perhaps some more specific considerations, which is this idea of skill transference and rich variability. So this is an anecdote I stole from Rafe Kelly, and I've just kind of riffed on it for a while now. Um, and basically, the idea is if you imagine two siblings who maybe they want to get their upper body stronger or whatever, they want to engage in some kind of physical activity. So sister one decides she's going to start training pull-ups. Sister two decides that she is going to join a bouldering gym. And you can look at this on a few different levels. But essentially, they're both going out, they're both using their muscles, they're both going to get stronger. At the end of the year, they're probably both going to have more pull-ups or more upper body strength. But then think of everything else that happens by coming along to this climbing gym. You make friends. You learn how to climb. You get better at climbing. You learn how to perceive these different climbing routes. People give you tips. You share ideas. Maybe with these friends you make, you're going to go out and you're going to go on these climbing expeditions and you get to go camping and your whole world gets bigger. And on top of that, in addition to your upper body strength, you're also working on your grip. You're working on your grip from multiple angles. You have this great variability of what your shoulders are doing. You're working on your hip mobility. You're working on this full body strength. So, the sister on the left there, at the end of the 9 months, the year, whatever, maybe she's increased her pull-ups by a few. So has the sister on the right. But then what is everything else that comes along from actually engaging in the activity versus engaging in a sort of reductive version or not really looking at the whole why of that? And what we find over and over and over again is by going out and doing things and not trying to isolate what we do into these little specific parts that we often have all these rich benefits that come together and add up over time, whether it's emotional or social or physiological or whatever. So, because my background is originally in sports conditioning, one of the favorite concepts that came out of sports conditioning is this idea of SAID, specific adaptations to impose demands. And this is a fancy way of saying if you want to get better at something, just do it. Just do the thing, just do different variations of the thing, a little bit heavier, a little bit faster, and over time you'll get better. As long as you give yourself opportunities to get the stimulus, to get this novel stress, and you give yourself enough opportunity to rest, over time you'll get better at whatever it is. The thing is this is true of everything we do in our body because our body is a complex system of systems. We have all these different dynamic reactions that are happening in our body at any one time. So while this said principle is true, like if I do a bunch of bicep curls, I'll get better at bicep curls. And maybe those bicep curls will help me climb, maybe they won't, but it'll certainly get my biceps bigger and stronger. But we can apply this to all kinds of things. If I want to get better at running, what I can do is over time I can add different forms of running into what I do. So maybe I'll start off with jogging. If my body handles it well, maybe I can do sprinting and then I'll get all this advantage. But said is true of all kinds of things. Said is true of social behavior, you know, or if we think of any of the fear of falling cycle, the pain avoidance cycle, isolation cycles and things like that, what we realize is we have these feedback loops. So our friend Aaron has started talking about this idea, the social frailty cycle. So a lot of people might know the fear of falling cycle, which is that if somebody falls, they'll develop a fear of falling. So they'll engage in fear behaviors where they might fall, which means that they get deconditioned and they start to lose confidence. Their world gets smaller and smaller, and then they're more likely to fall again. And what Erin's done that's really nice is she's sort of pulled this back and she's looked at this idea of social frailty, which is that it's not just about the physical aspects. It's not just about your muscular strength or your power production or your bone density. It's also about how all these different factors fit into your whole life. So this idea of social disconnection, people become socially isolated. Then they have reduced activity because they're not going out into the world. So they might have this declining strength and balance, which is going to lead to lower confidence. And all these things are going to lead to increased fall risk, which is going to lead to further withdrawal. So what she's done is she's taken the classic fear of falling cycle, and then she's layered in more psychological and social aspects to it, which I think is really important. But the thing about this cycle is it's true of everything. And it's also true that in many cases we can reverse it. If we give people more opportunities for social connection, then we can increase their activity, which means that they're going to have more opportunities to increase or maintain their strength and balance and other components. It's going to increase their confidence, which is going to reduce their fall risk, which is going to give them more opportunities to go out into the world. So it's going to create this virtuous cycle that we see over and over and over again with all these things. You'll hear me use this term affordances. And affordances are just opportunities in the environment for you to interact with. An affordance is anything in the world that invites you to interact with it or elicit some kind of behavior or response. And what we see is the more opportunities people have to engage with the world around them, the more they do it, which allows them to receive more opportunities. And then we create this really beautiful feedback loop, which again is one of those things that's more complex than just getting you stronger or whatever. So I want to talk about because this is this idea of gym strength versus real world strength. And this is a bit that I might skip through a few slides because some of them are redundant and they're all there in the presentation if you want to look at them. So I just want to talk about some of these differences. So gym strength, it often has what's sometimes called a narrow range of expression, or what I just called a narrow range of expression. I don't know if that's a real term. And it's often, gym movements are often designed to remove the weakest link. So here we have a gentleman who's trying to bench press, and you think about the idea of a bench press, and it's such a strange idea. The modern bench didn't really exist until about the 1950s or so. And the idea is you have a special bench that you sit on, you lie on your back, and then you have a special rack above you. And in that special rack, you put this barbell that's a specific circumference that has this perfectly distributed weight. And then you lie on your back so that you can go ahead and get a horizontal pushing motion right here. Now, I'm not saying any of this stuff is bad, and I myself bench press. I just, want to build some context here. Um, and then often the hardest part of the bench press is getting the bench off of the J hooks, getting them off the hooks. So often you'll have two spotters. You'll have two spotters on either side, and they'll lift it out for you. That way you don't have to worry about getting your shoulder in a weird position. And then what you do is you lower it down in the straightest line possible, and then you bring it back up, and then your spotters sometimes help you to put it back onto the hooks again. So it's this really, really contrived set of motions and this context to allow you to press a bar like that. And that's great. And people can walk around and say, well, I can bench 100 kilos or something. But then we want to think, well, what does that actually mean? Well, how would one be in a position where they're lying on the back pressing this perfectly weighted thing? And the idea is, well, maybe there's transference to real life. And of course, there's some transference to real life. But we spend all this time developing this hyper specific skill because we like to see the number go up on the chart. But then we don't actually think, well, is this going to maximize the amount of transference? And like I said, there's lots of whys. If you like going to the gym and working out, that's great. If that's your why is because you like going to the gym and gym culture, that's great. But I think sometimes we lose the forest through the trees. And we see this over and over and over again in all kinds of movements, whether, it's a barbell overhead press or a deadlift or any of these movements that are, technically functional in that you're lifting something up, but they often don't have great transfer to the real world because they're so contrived and the setup is so specific, and they often lack variability. Um, and a lot of times, gym strength is decontextualized. So often, if I'm going to the pull-up example, it's great that you get your pull-ups up, but actually, do pull-ups carry over to climbing a tree? And not really. And what I mean is, if you've ever climbed a tree, climbing a tree is a whole body movement. You're stretching, you're using your hips. I find my biggest limitation when climbing a tree is my hip mobility. So you get your flexibility. It's also the importance of being able to perceive these affordances. Can you pick a good route on a tree? Do you have a good sense of how you're going to get back down again? All these things that are really important. So we assume, well, if I do pull-ups a lot, it'll make me better at climbing trees, or it'll make me better at climbing this, or it'll help me engage in the sport. And maybe that's true up to a point. But often it misses all that other richness and benefits of creating opportunities to do the thing itself. Another example might be box jumps in CrossFit. I used to do a lot of box jumps. Um, and I'm not naturally a great jumper. I got to this point where I could do this repetitive motion quite a lot. But then I found that when it came time for me to try to jump over a stream or try to jump high or low on something else, that actually it didn't account for all the psychological factors and the fear and all these things that you can sort of help calibrate if you have opportunities to do the thing themselves. So again, I'm not saying there's no transference from the gym. I'm just saying that when we decontextualize it, it often doesn't actually help people go out into the world and do the things that they want to do. Um, this is Mike Israetel here. The reason I have Mike Israetel on here is because he's quite a famous strength coach, but he's been doing a series of videos recently where he's been trying to do things in real life, like climb and run and jump. And sort of what he's realized is even though he's very, very strong and very muscular, he's kind of been, joking around it himself is that he actually can't run, he can't jump. There are all these things he can't really do, even though at some level he's super hyper specifically trained. And this is something that Katie Bowman talks about all the time. She says that, this generation, this cohort of people alive today have this very strange combination of being hyper overtrained and chronically undertrained at the same time. And we see this a lot in the gym because we don't get a lot of variability in gym movement. What we see is sometimes we have these really, really strong muscles that are right next to really weak or undeveloped muscles. And the classic example is if you see a bodybuilder or somebody try to sprint, even if they stretch and they warm up, they do all these things, they start sprinting, and you just see them pull a hamstring like that. And it's sort of just become this cliche joke. Issue is these people have built up these incredibly strong glute muscles, the incredibly strong hamstrings, incredibly strong quads, calves, all these different things. But when you try to put it together in an actual pattern, you try to run, either you're going to have an overtrained muscle meet the limitations of an undertrained muscle or fascia or whatever, or you just might not have put the whole movement together. And a lot of times this is exacerbated from this idea of trying to have perfect form on something. When the more we try to focus on perfect form on certain movements, and we don't actually interrogate what that perfect form means or where it comes from, then it means that all of a sudden we have the super low variability movement where if we can add a little bit of variability in terms of different objects, angles, context, things like that, that you can actually build up a much more robust and resilient system. Um, Another issue with gym strength is sometimes quantification create a false sense of precision or knowledge. This is going back to, I had that picture from, this is Spinal Tap, where he said, well, this dial goes to 11. A lot of times you'll be in the gym and people will have these machines and sometimes they'll have weights on them like, 30 kg, 40 kg, 50 kg, whatever. But because, and there's nothing wrong with this, I'm just creating context here, because of all the series of cams and pulleys and levers and things like that, often the person is not moving that weight. But even that point is arbitrary because it actually doesn't matter what something weighs. What does a sofa weigh? What does your child weigh? What does a bag of potting soil weigh? And really, sort of what's more important is rather than focusing on the specific quantification of what an object weighs, is if you go up to something and you kind of move it around and interact with it, do you have a good sense of whether or not you can lift it and what you can do with it? Um, rather than focusing on specifically what the object says. And, I'll talk about this in a bit, but this idea of moving day strength, if you're going to go out and help your friends move, it doesn't really matter what the thing weighs. It doesn't matter what the refrigerator weighs. You just need to work together. Um, I see that we've got a raised hand. I can take a little break here. How are we doing on questions? Jill, are you around? Let's see. Chat.
Yeah, I've just been sharing.
Yeah,
I just shared Erin's link.
Oh, cool. Sanket, I see that you have a question. I can go ahead and answer that.
yeah, yeah. Andrew, you were mentioning about this person who was going to the gym who is trying out several different things. Can you just mention the name of the person in the chat so that I can refer to him later?
Oh, Mike Israetel? Yeah,
Oh,
I can were you talking about the strong guy running?
yeah.
Yeah.
If you can just mention the name in the chat.
Yeah, it's Mike Israetel. I've put it in right now, and he's a PhD in sports science. He's sort of turned into
Got
an
it.
influencer. Um,
Thank you. Thank
but there you
you.
go.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, cool. All right, I'll keep on going. Um, so the other thing I want to talk about is this idea of gym strength is gym machines or sometimes the gym space itself has a negative affordance. And what I mean is, and you've maybe heard me say this before, when you go to a gym, often the purpose of the gym is not to allow movement, it's actually to constrain people's choice in movement. And that sounds like a weird statement, but if you walked into an empty room and there was nothing there except there was just maybe a few handles and some ropes and some things to climb on, a lot of people might say, "Oh, well, what am I supposed to do with this?" I actually don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. Like, there's a rope over there. I don't really know how to climb a rope. There's some pommel horses. There's some stall bars, whatever. That's great, but what do I do? And that's because a lot of times people haven't really developed this perception, action sort of competence, or this idea of how to interact with the environment. The example I always use is we have some nieces and nephews from the city, and whenever they come out to the rural area in the woods, they don't know what to do in the forest. They get bored. But all the kids who are raised in the forest, they're out there with tree houses and sticks and playing pirates and getting muddy and things like that. They sort of see the opportunities that are out there. Um, and the anecdote I use all the time is I remember Jill went to a gym in Edinburgh maybe like a year ago, and she was trying to pick up some objects and carry them, and the gym manager very politely said, "I'm sorry, you can't use the space for that. Can you just stick with the machines?" And obviously that makes sense because they don't have a lot of real estate, they don't have a lot of room. So when you go into a gym, gyms are these spaces where you have these prescribed acceptable movements for the most part. That's what most gyms are. So in a lot of ways, these gym machines, they're negative affordances, or you can just think of them as very constrained affordances, where you go and they say, okay, well, here's how you use this machine. So I just picked two. So the one up top, it looks like some sort of back extension or hip extension machine. So you sit in the machine and you dial in the weight correctly. You get it so everything's just right, and then you work on going back like that. And there are lots of reasons why that might be an appropriate machine for somebody based on rehabilitation or whatever. But this is also one of the easiest movements that you can do. You can see the person's their feet aren't planted on the ground. The angle of the weight and everything is prescribed. If they have weird anthropometry, it might not be a good match for their angles. But more importantly, this is something that you can very easily train in the real world, and you don't need a machine. I would guess that machine off the top of my head probably costs about 5,000 pounds. Gym machines are very expensive. So we have this machine that's created to I would say do a rough sort of mimicry of what a movement is. But that means by using that machine, the person is losing all these opportunities to interact with the world around them because they've isolated this down to a hip extension machine. This one on the bottom, I thought was very clever. I also like the expression, the woman sort of making quite like a sultry, I don't know, cat-like look at the camera. This is a crawling machine. So this is a multi-thousand-dollar machine. Maybe this case a little bit cheaper. Maybe it's a few hundred pounds. And it's a machine that allows you to simulate crawling, which I understand why you might need this if you have a lack of space or something. I mean, if I was going to be very generous, maybe I could come up with a reason. But however much space that machine takes up, one could just as easily crawl forwards and backwards, or one could do a figure eight or make a loop. There are lots of ways. I suspect that any of the space saving arguments for this machine don't overcome the fact that it's very expensive. You're doing this sort of stripped down version of crawling without actually getting the benefits of learning how to crawl, without actually getting the benefits of moving from A to B. So a lot of times these displace the opportunities to perceive and interact with sort of natural affordances in the world. So again, this idea of climbing a tree, picking up a rock, using your body to solve movement problems. And again, you don't want to fall into the trap of mocking these things, but I think it's good to interrogate and think, is this useful? And also, are the stated excuses for using these machines, are they legitimate as well? Because sometimes people will say, well, if you have a lack of space, this helps. I think it'd be very hard outside of perhaps a rehabilitation context to justify having a back extension machine when one could just have something heavy that they want to pick up, or something not even very heavy that they want to pick up. You could do the same thing with a band that costs about 3 pounds. Okay. Um, Continuing on this idea of gym strength. Gym strength, there's this big emphasis on discrete repetitions versus rich movement problems. So I'll go back to this idea of moving with your friends, you have this logic in the gym of doing repetition. So, okay, well, I'm going to do 3 sets of 8 deadlifts at this weight, whatever. I'm going to do these lifts. I'm going to make sure that every single rep looks the same. I'm moving along the same planes. I want to make sure that my shoulders are retracted, my spine is neutral. I want to make sure that my hips and shoulders keep the same relationship as I lower down, all these things. But that's not how we move things in real life. When you move things, you don't move things in reps, and that seems obvious, but it's actually quite a big deal. So again, if you're helping your friend on moving day, you're not doing reps of picking up a box and putting it back down. You're picking up a box, you're handling it, you're trying to navigate stairs, you've got different angles, you have to watch out to see if it's slippery, you constantly have to shift the box. It's probably not a very comfortable angle, so you're always moving it around. And each of these things, you're getting all this benefit. All of a sudden, you're using your upper back muscles differently. You're using your core differently. It's this richness that I think is easy to gloss over, but it is really important. And I really like to pick up sandbags quite a lot. And when you do sandbag training, you can't really think of it as like 3 by 5 reps because every single time you pick up a sandbag, the movement takes so much longer. From a physiological standpoint, sure, we're more time under tension, but there's even more than that. That constant relationship you have with the object as you're actually trying to pick it up, you're solving all these little problems. Maybe I picked it up from the wrong angle. Maybe the sand had shifted in a different direction. Maybe as I picked it up, I didn't get grip, so I quickly have to adjust. And that is all learning that we don't get when we just try to isolate these movements. Um, and this shows up in what I was talking about earlier, this concepts that you hear like farm strength, anaconda strength, field strength, dad strength, moving day strength, all these different terms that you hear bandied about. What this is talking about is this talking about this sort of embedded sort of practical capability that you get from interacting with the real world as opposed to, building up muscles in a gym. I already talked about this one a little bit, this idea of a variability deficit, which is just that sometimes in the gym or in gym context, we try to make every single rep look the same. In the real world, every rep isn't the same. If you were trail running, every single step you take is different. This idea of trying to develop this perfect gait, while it makes sense in certain contexts, is really contrived. Out in the real world, unless you're running on a road or in, some human paved area, you're not going to have flat ground. You're going to have bumps and potholes and rocks and textures and all these different things. And when you see people running out in the world, they don't have this perfect gait. And think of how the environment will elicit different things, running uphill versus running downhill, changing direction. What's the context in what you're running? Are you chasing someone? Are you being chased by someone? Are you playing a game? Are you conserving energy? Are you trying to hit the bus? All these things are going to elicit um, different expressions of this idea of running. And again, when we try to recreate this same form over and over and over again, there's a lot of good arguments that it's leading to overuse injuries. So you've heard me talk about this before, but this idea of variability overuse hypothesis. There are a lot of physios and people who think that one of the reasons we see these high injury rates is because people have so little variability in their movement and they try to get the perfect serve, they try to get the perfect stride, they try to get the perfect kick over and over and over again. Whereas if there were more variability in the system, we'd see a lot of these overuse injuries are probably reduced. This is one that comes up a lot because and there's an article that was going around Instagram the other day that I think was being talked about that was guilty of this, which is this sort of confusion between rules-based and task-based. And sometimes it really gets muddied because we have this idea of functional fitness, functional training. So the classic one that shows up over and over and over again is you see it in CrossFit and High Rocks. So here's a New York Times article. And it says, complete your squat. The internet is watching. As the fitness competition High Rocks gains momentum, it is facing criticism from people who think one movement in particular is not being judged correctly. And it's talking about this idea of wall balls, which is something that High Rocks took from CrossFit. And it's this sort of repetitive monostructural movement where you have a medicine ball, you squat down, you explode up, you hit a target on the wall, it bounces down, you catch it, you absorb the energy, and you cycle it through. And the problem is when you have these sports like High Rocks or CrossFit, you get the no rep. And the no rep is when you're not doing the movement correctly based upon whatever the rules of the movement are. The problem is these are absolutely artificial. And what I mean is the rule on a wall ball is you must come down to a below parallel squat every single time. That's arbitrary because that's not the area where you're going to produce the most power. And different people are going to have different anthropometries depending on your hip shape, depending on the length of your femur, your ankle flexibility, your overall height. Your squat is going to be completely different. So to say that everyone must arbitrarily hit a certain depth, a certain aesthetic squat depth in a squat, it doesn't account for all these differences. But also it mistakes the whole thing The task we're trying to do is we're trying to launch this ball up so the ball hits a target, but we've added in all these additional rules that haven't really been interrogated. So a lot of times when people think of this is good form and this is bad form, what they're talking about is they're talking about rules in a game or a competition, but they often don't actually think about the why behind those rules. So even when we talk about this functional training and things, they often fail to identify the why. Why are people doing this movement? Actually, what is the task that we're trying to do? So again, just this idea of decontextualized movement. So just really thinking about what does the movement accomplish, or what does this activity, what do these series of movements actually accomplish? In what context, with whom, for whom, why? That's the big one, and for what reason, you know? So I just have a picture here of a waiter, and they're moving some food, and the social, the psychological, you know, all these contextual factors, like them moving that food in a busy restaurant has so many different implications um, than it might if you're trying to, I don't know, pick up a kettlebell and move it in a farmer's carry. Even a farmer's carry, which I think is a great movement, it is going to be disconnected from all these other factors. You know, are the customers in a hurry? Did you get the order right? Are you going to drop the food? Are you carrying a bottle of wine that costs £1,000? All these things are going to change the quality of the movement. Um, and all these things are really important because when we want to go out into the real world and do these things, we want to make sure that we haven't scrubbed all these variables away. Which brings us just this idea of representative task design. So this is used a lot in constraints-led approach and various ecological dynamical systems theories and things like that, which is just this idea that if you want to maximize this perception action coupling, which is this idea of your awareness in the environment, your awareness of affordances, your awareness of the everything that's happening around you, and then tying it to the appropriate movement strategy. And this is really what skill is this maximizing this perception action coupling to make sure that people's own personal capacities are sort of lined up with the environment and the task. So you want to think about how representative the task is, but it's something that's much, much bigger than should we make this heavier? Should we make it lighter? Should we move faster? Often in the gym, this idea of gym logic is do more of it, make it heavier, do it faster. And that's going to cover all the factors. But as we've seen, there's a lot more to the world than just, you know, picking up things heavier, moving them faster, doing it more. Um, so the question is, well, how do we map out all these human capabilities, or how do we map out the various richness of what we're trying to do when we engage with the world? And the answer is it's very complicated. And lots of people try, and some people have been more successful than others. So we want to think, well, where do we begin? We try to think about what tasks humans are capable of. How do we categorize them? Is it best just to make a big list in taxonomy? Can we apply broad theories that have explanatory power? So can we just kind of have these like big overall ideas? How do we account for different contexts? All sorts of things. So here's a wheel I have. I'll talk about that later. But people have tried it. I don't want to get bogged down into this, but uh, you know, for years, for, you know, literally hundreds of years, but certainly since the post-war era, you've seen different people try to make sense of what humans are capable of. So E.A. Fleischman, he has this idea of the human ability taxonomy, and he just tried to list every single human ability and using it for terms in terms of like labor, safety, ergonomics, things like that. So I'm not going to go over all 52, but this is one way of doing it, is trying to make a big list. Okay. Other people have tried to do it. You have this OneNet or OnNet, and it's this list of vocational abilities. So anything from gross body coordination, flexibility, dynamic strength. Again, it's just a big list of things. It gets very overwhelming and something always falls through the cracks. WHO has tried this with this ICF, where they try to look at all the different opportunities that people can interact with the world. How do you list it? And you end up with this very big, complicated table with all these different clauses and subclauses. Essentially, doing a big taxonomy of everything humans are capable of is probably a losing strategy because it's just too complicated and you're not going to account for everything. So, one, I guess, set of theories have started to become popular. A lot of this started with Bernstein in the 1960s, but this is Carl Newell's theory of constraints. And with constraints, the way he looks at it, and what I think is quite an elegant solution to this, is you just think in any task, whatever you're trying to do, you want to think, what are you trying to do? What's the context you're trying to do it? And what are your current abilities? You know, so you look at the individual constraints. How tall am I? How fast am I? How strong I am? how fit I am or whatever. It's going to be unique to you. This could even include things like, am I sick? Am I injured? Do I have, have I suffered from an amputation? Something like that. You can look at any of that. The environmental constraints are things like, weather, light, sound, texture, all these other considerations. And then the task is, well, what is it that you're actually trying to do? Can we define what it is that you're trying to do? Um, there we go. And this is sort of tied into also the idea of physical literacy, which we won't talk so much in this, but it's just trying to make sense of how humans exist in their environment and what their relationship to their movement and environment is over their life. And I think the physical literacy documentation is good. And a lot of that is also taking Newell's ideas and other people's ideas into account. So this is me trying to get to my point now. So this is what we've been trying to work on, okay? And I don't want to get bogged down in this, but essentially we've been trying to make sense of this thing. Can we look at the different tasks that humans are capable of doing, like locomotion, getting from A to B, object control, can you pick something up and move it around? Positional transition, can you get from low to high, high to low? Can you get from the ground standing up? Can you get from standing up to the ground? Can you shift positions? This idea of stabilizing and reorienting yourself, essentially it's balance, but it's also, recovery, it's having a sense of place. And then finally, this idea of intercepting and avoiding things. Can you get out of the way of things? Can you run over towards things? Think about playing a game of tag or trying to hit a baseball. So these are all the different physical tasks we talk about. And then we want to think about, well, what are all the different factors that can modify those tasks? What's the physical environment? So again, is it rainy out? Is it muddy out? Is it foggy out? Is it cold? The informational environment. What else is happening? Are there lots of people running around yelling commands? Do you have all the information you need? The design demand rules. Are you playing a game? Are you trying to do something in real life? Social, cultural. Are you doing it around other people? Are you doing it by yourself? Is there competition? Are you being evaluated? Are you doing it in a public space? All these different things that are going to affect why and how you do something. What's your own internal state? Are you hungry? Are you tired? And then finally, what we do is we look at, well, what are the capacities that you're bringing to the task? What's your muscular force? Are you able to produce and utilize force? Do you have access to different positions? And that could be anything from mobility to having an injury, having a joint impingement, um, having an amputation. What about your metabolic or bioenergetic constraints? This is sort of your conditioning, your cardiovascular, et cetera. Your coordination, can you recreate different complex movements? If someone's dancing, can you dance with them? If someone shows you a movement, can you pick it up? Can you sort of put these movements together? Psychosocial, just dealing with one's own anxieties, confidence, fears, things like that. And then affordance perception, which is, when you're in an environment, can you take advantage of all those affordances that are there? And obviously, all these things overlap. Um, but that's kind of what we're looking at. So when we're looking at tasks and things like that, the question we want to ask is, what are we trying to accomplish? Okay. Um, what is specific to this task? Why are we doing this? Where are we doing this? In what context? What kind of surface? Is it a real life situation? What's happening around us? And then we can look at our individual capacities. So can we create and utilize force? Can our body currently get in this position? All these other considerations that I don't want to really drag down or get stuck into, but essentially this idea of how do we start making sense of tasks. So that's kind of our goal that we've been thinking about, is how can we try to recreate these rich opportunities and give people the tools just to kind of think about all these different ways that we can engage with the environment. Um, so I guess one of the things we can ask is, what's an example of this? And I think Jill's going to come back in a second.
I'm here.
Oh, okay. Jill, do you want to lead this bit?
Yeah, so we were just thinking, given that we don't know very many of you on the call, and we're not sure what your capabilities are right now, we just wanted to give you an example now. If you've been on our in-person course, we use this one. So if you think about a deadlift, if you're not into working out, deadlifts generally using a barbell, but they could be kettlebell or dumbbells, but you're just lifting up something from generally below the hips. So in this picture, you've got a woman, she's doing a deadlift. The goal here, let's say, is to lift the bar for 12 repetitions. And within that, if you were doing that within a gym, you might have points of performance that look like straight back, big chest, feet roughly hip distance apart, hands on the outside, bum down low, chest up high, thinking about this idea of good form and repeating that 12 times. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. We do this within progressive strength training. It's a really useful skill. But if we want to now look at the next slide, while an example of an emergent pickup, and this is really useful because you can kind of use your environment to think about all these kind of wiggly in between positions or in between strength that we talk about quite a lot. So instead of recreating a perfect deadlift, and we can do this all together, we'll just use one example. But quite often we talk about if you've had kids or you've been looking after nieces and nephews, grandchildren, sometimes they'll fall asleep in the middle of the double bed, and it's really difficult to pick them up because they're asleep and they're kind of not a set, they're all over the place, and you've got to try and get in there and try and pick them up without them waking up and then put them into their bed. So there's just a bunch of movements that will not look anything like a deadlift. Another option that we often talk about is sort of picking up a stinky dog or picking up the bins. You've got to get them over to the wheelie bins, and you don't want to get bin juice on you. Again, that pickup will look very, very different from a conventional deadlift, and it will kind of elicit all of these different kind of movements that you end up in. And then the last one is thinking if you were in a flood, say, let's say the flood is quite high up and you've dropped something, but you want to keep your phone out of that flood. So how could you pick that something up from down on the bottom of the flood floor while keeping your phone dry? So let's just spend a minute. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can pick one of these scenarios. And if you've got a bag or a pillow or anything nearby, see if you can, maybe we'll go for the sleepy child. You can get up, see if we can pick up the sleepy child. The child can't be woken up, so it's a very quiet and gentle movement. And you've got to pick them out of a wobbly double bed, see if you can scoop them up, and then try and deposit them in their bed, whatever that looks like. You don't need to keep your camera on for this. You can just go and give it a go in your kitchen or living room, wherever you are.
So yeah, just find some space, find something like a pillow or a bag, something that's pretty heavy, and just think, nah, I want to pick this up as quickly and as forcefully as possible. Think, I'm in a bed, I want to be quiet, I want to pick this child up gently, and I want to be able to move them and put them back down again. Okay, keep in mind you're on a bed, so you can't just stand up on the bed and wiggle the whole thing. So how do you do it as quietly and gently as possible? So we'll just give everyone a minute just to play around with this. And I'll go do it too, and then we'll come back. Okay. Where is it? There's my child. I just found a pillow on the ground.
Quite often we do this in groups, so it can come up, you end up seeing people come up with some pretty creative solutions for picking up in very different ways. And it does get you thinking about this whole world of strength outside of this kind of perfect deadlift. There are a bunch of different ways you can do this. We just thought pickups was a good example to do on the call. Andrew, anything else on that slide before we go on?
Let me see what comes next. Okay, yeah, let me stick with here.
Yeah.
So I think we can open up to questions while we're talking, and I'll throw a few questions to the group, and we could do, please feel free to drop it in the chat, or in a second, if you raise your hand, we can take you off mute as well. But the thing I want to think about is what are the sort of qualities that are merged in picking that up? And some people might say, oh, well, it's a bit like a Turkish getup or some other formalized getup activity. But it's always interesting to see. I think there's a big difference to see if you create a situation or context that elicits a certain kind of movement or allows a certain kind of movement solution to emerge. That's much, much different than telling someone they have to do a movement. And what I mean is telling someone that you want them to squat 3 sets of 20 with a kettlebell is going to be much, much different than creating a situation that elicits a squat-like movement that people have to do. And I think that there's going to be a whole host of benefits there that are sometimes hard to quantify, but are definitely real. So, all right. So we'll look at the chat and then see what else. Oh yeah, okay. So that's good. I wanted to know some observations. So Sophie said she really felt it engage her core a lot. Yeah, that's true. So I don't know what your situation looked like, but for me, I get down really low and then I get next to the object. This works really well with a sandbag or a medicine ball, or we were just gifted an old child boxing bag, a punching bag that's filled with rags, and that one's really nice. And you get down really low to it, and you sort of come up and you curl up to it. Yeah, Steven said soft movement, slow and steady. I think that's really good. Because we always think about moving as powerfully as possible, but there's sometimes where being able to move slowly or quietly or being able to achieve stillness. These are all these different variables that often don't come out when we only think about power. Yeah, Marianne said, I felt like I need a lot of balance. Yeah, that's right. So you get down on the ground, and if you're holding something like a baby, you're going to have one whole hand holding it. So then how do you get back up again? Because all of a sudden you don't have both hands as you want to get back up. You also don't want to do anything jerky. So what positions come out of that? So already we can see we're engaging our core differently. We need to focus on soft movement and slow movement, which is often much more challenging, requires a lot more stability. Sanket says carried an open suitcase, ended up making noise from the wobbly stool. Yeah, okay, very good. So you made some noise. You think, oh, what would I have woken the child up? But then you quickly adapted and you came up with a movement solution that was appropriate for the task.
I think the thing to add here as well is a lot of these movements are really valuable. They're really hard to put into the context of a workout. So that's why they often don't show up within an exercise class or within the gym, because it'd be very hard to say, right, I need you to go and pick up the sleeping baby 20 times as quietly and slowly
Yeah.
as possible. It just doesn't quite work. So
No.
if we're doing it within a class setting, we have different classes for different populations, but generally we'll have a bit at the beginning of every class after the warm up where we spend a bit of time working in partners on different movement challenges. And for our more advanced class, the end of that class will look like a more conventional workout. But there is always this period of kind of figuring out stuff, which means that you can kind of you're not under any time pressure, and actually it's quite a nice time to have a chat and figure things out. And for us, when we're facilitating those sessions, we learn so much because the chatter that is going on, and people are really creative when you give them the space. They will come up with different kind of workarounds every single time, and it's fascinating to watch, but it is really difficult to think, oh, how could I get more of this in if I'm going to do it as part of my workout? Normally it's a different time of day. It's a different way of kind of wiggling it in.
Yeah, it's sort of about creating spaces that make different kinds of strategies appropriate. So as Jill was saying, a lot of times if you're in a boot camp or a CrossFit style setting, even if you tell people, well, I want you to move quietly or slowly or for quality, but you're scoring them based on how quickly or fast they do something, then there's a mismatch between the design of the activity and sort of what you're incentivizing or eliciting. So it's important to create space, and this is a big thing when we think about task design, is how can we create a space or environment or situation that elicits the different kinds of qualities that we're looking for. So again, getting away from the idea of more, faster, better, things like that, and really thinking about, well, how can we create an opportunity for people to explore these different qualities?
There's a really good comment from
Yeah.
Sophie that there's so much fear around awkward movements and people worried about injury and pain, and a huge barrier for many is people who've been injured previously and hypervigilant about pain. Yeah, agreed. And I
Great
think
point.
a lot of when we started the Nature Moves program, which is all emergent, we worked initially with older populations, and because it's all problem solving and task based, it might mean that they come to the first 3 or 4 sessions and they just have a nice chat with their partner and maybe they try a little bit. But when you can get them out of the idea of, oh, we should be squatting or we should be hinging, to let's see how many creative ways we can do this thing, they kind of get into a different headspace and suddenly they're doing movements that they hadn't thought were possible, and you haven't really told them to do anything, but they've kind of got to a point where they can give themselves the permission to have a go. And that doesn't always happen in class one, it happens in over time. And is that sort of rich social context of knowing that you've partnered them with somebody who's nice and chatty and they're having a nice time and they're like, actually, you know what, I will just give it a go this week. And they just kind of try it and suddenly you're like, oh, I didn't even know that I could still do that thing. And it's not anything that we've done. It's just they're chatting with their partner and having a nice time, and suddenly it's happened.
Yeah. And just to parrot what Jill said, I think that's also the importance of game and play. And I think it's something I didn't say explicitly. One of the great things about this style of training is it just turns into games. So I'm using sort of sterile language like, create environments and design activities and things like that. But actually, a lot of these are games. If you can come up with interesting games or playful activities, then people get over that fear in their head about doing things the right way or the wrong way. And again, a lot of these assumptions about the right or wrong way to do things, a lot of these are very outdated. And a lot of these ideas also just sort of reinforce certain existing institutions. So, really what we're seeing in the literature, the way we think about pain, and things like that is actually it's much more complex than just if I move this way, it will hurt. And what we find a lot of times is as people can kind of build up their movement options and their solution options, that a lot of the chronic pain that we see is often associated. I don't want to get too much into this, but there's a big psychosocial component to as well, which isn't to say that there aren't real physiological things, but it is to say that if you can give people opportunities to kind of remap their capabilities, then a lot of their fears and their fear of pain often becomes much less restricting, and then they can build up that resilience that's so important.
Sorry, I'm aware of the time. We're basically done.
Yeah. Yeah. So if anyone has any other questions, please drop them into chat, or if you want, raise your hand, or because there's not a big rush, you could probably just take yourself off mute if you wanted to.
We can just go to the next couple of slides because there's a few
Oh,
like
yeah,
things to think
good
about
idea.
as you go. Um, so yeah, just what else? Just keep keep going and doing the things that you really like. Real life activities are hard to quantify, but they're brilliant for so many things that you can't put your finger on. And then keep going with progressive strength training 2 to 3 times a week. Um, we'll just do one more, get to the end of this, Andrew.
No, I'll
Okay,
answer your
yeah.
question.
You'll have
Yeah.
the slides. There's some good questions on the slides that you could take and have a think about if you want to start thinking more about playful and emergent movement patterns in amongst your life. That's a strange phrase. And we've got some more links at the end as well to some webinars and that kind of thing. Next one. I think this is the last one.
Okay.
Here we go. So there's some, we've got the strength training webinar if you want the kind of other side of this coin. We've got our Movements for Life course, which the door's open for that this evening, but if you want to join the waiting list, then you get early bird discounts if you scan that code, but I'll send it in an email. And that is, it's the course that we've been wanting to do for ages and haven't quite worked out how to do. And so it's kind of all of the emergent and fun stuff, whereas the Strong for Life course is very much more structured progressive strength training, which we kind of needed to do first. And then there's a free download if you want 5 days of playful movement, that kind of thing. Let's go to questions because I think that's us on slides.
Could you just check the post? Sorry, I'm
The
getting my
post.
passport in.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, hang on.
So we've got a few questions. Thanks for joining, Liz. See you later. We'll catch up with you later. So Sue has a question. What does emergent movement patterns mean? Yeah, good question. That sounds fancy. It's the difference between solutions that you come up with on your own, um, and somebody telling you how to do something. So what I mean is, if exactly what we just did with the sleeping baby activity, without telling you how to do something, how do you solve that problem on your own? And then how can we layer in more challenges to make it interesting, as opposed to me breaking it down into steps? So a prescriptive movement pattern would be, I want you to stand with your feet hip width apart, and I want you to keep your chest up, retract your shoulder blades. I want you to push your hips back, flex at the hips and flex at the knees until you hit a full squat. And then from there, I want you to pick something up. And emergent would be, hey, I want you to pick this up and I want you to see how you solve that problem and then see what kind of patterns you use automatically. Um, yep. See you soon, Steve. Thanks.
That's it, I think. If anyone got any more
Sankit
questions?
had a question. Yeah, so I know Sankit, you had your hand up as well. So I'll ask this, and if you have another question, I can ask as well. So Sankit was asking, should we always be continuing to do regular strength training? I think up to a point, I think that there's more benefit in regular strength training if you haven't done it before. There is going to be, in a way, in strength conditioning, we call it sometimes capping training. There are going to be diminishing returns. And what I mean is the difference between getting your squat from a 10-kilo squat up to a body weight squat is going to have a lot of benefits. The benefits of getting your body weight squat, say, let's say I weigh about 90 kilos, the benefits of squatting much past that are the return on investment is going to be lower and lower and lower. So often people exercise because they like the habit or the ritual or the patterns of doing the movement. But past a certain point, the benefits aren't going to be as strong. So once you kind of have built up this capacity, you're probably going to get more benefits and quality of life from going out and doing things and learning skills. So like let's say once you can do X amount of pull-ups, go engage with some climbing, see if you can find some friends and climb, for example. Or, once you've gotten to the point where, let's say you can run a mile at a certain speed, if that's your goal, why not join a football league and play some football? Things like that. So I think that the structured training is great, especially if you're starting off without much experience. But then I think the benefits generally go down. If you see someone who's training for powerlifting and they want to get, like a 400 kilo squat, they're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices in their life to get that 400 kilo squat. Same thing, like if you want to get a really fast marathon time, other parts of your life, you need to decide why you're doing it and if you want to get a world-class marathon time or if you just enjoy running a few times a week.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Vivian.
We'll share the slides and the recording and any other bits and bobs that came up. Thank you very much for
Good,
sitting
good to see you,
through
Emma.
our thoughts process.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for sticking around.
All right. Have a good afternoon. See you later.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.